beautiful morning. Oh, what a beautiful day. Well, hello, partners. It's your old pal Salt Lick, the Strummin Cowboy, here to tell you another story. Can you say howdy to old Salt Lick? Howdy? Y'all are talking good cowboy talk and you're hearing it too. Well, I reckon you want to hear old Salt Lick tell you a story. If you want to hear a story, say, yee-haw! Well, that was a powerful good yeehaw, and I bet it made y'all all feel good too, didn't it? But you know what? Sometimes you don't feel so good. You feel like you maybe ain't doing good enough or not quite good enough for somebody else. That's when you feel like you've been rejected. Do y'all remember what rejection is? That's right. Y'all are smart as whips. Rejection is withholding love. And take it from me, everybody has felt rejection. Well, today's story is about a feller who had a whole passload of rejection. And even from his own family. Well, I like to call him Little Joe, because I love his story so much I feel like we rode together as partners. Now this here Little Joe, he ain't the same Joseph that was married to Jesus' mama Mary. No, this here Joe was long before that Joseph, that Christmas time Joseph. Now let's all get saddled up and listen to the story. Well, Joe was the youngest boy of 11 brothers, and I'll tell you this, none of his brothers liked him. They thought he was his pa's favorite and got special treatment. They liked him about as much as a horse likes a rattler. Come to think of it, nobody likes a rattler. Well, anyway, Joe's brothers done some awful mean things and said some mean things to him. Now, one day, Joe's pa gave him an amazing coat, which looked like nobody had ever seen. But none of his brothers got a coat like that, and I'll tell you this, they was madder than a bunch of wet hens. Just between us, they probably smelt like a bunch of wet hens, too. Well, they was mad, and they took and they throwed him into a deep, dark hole in the ground, and some of them was so doggone mad at him, they said, just leave him there to die. Can you imagine the kind of rejection Little Joe felt? Well, one of them brothers wasn't quite so mean, and they said to the others, well, let's don't kill him, let's just sell him off as a slave and make some money. Can you imagine the rejection Little Joe felt? His own brother sold him off as a slave just to get shed of him. Well, I tell you what, to be sold as a slave is one bad thing. To be sold by your brothers is twice as bad. Well, that weren't all neither, because them that bought him took him far away from his home and his family, clear to Egypt. You know, that's where they have all them pointy pyramids and such. Well, Little Joe sure did feel lost. But listen close to this. Even though Joe's brothers rejected him and treated him real bad, he knew God never had rejected him. Just like God will never reject you, even if others might. Well, you know, God was with Little Joe the whole time, even though it was often a really rough trail. And you know, Joe could have felt sorry for himself and got trapped in one of those rejection cycles, but he chose better. Now, even though Little Joe couldn't escape from that deep, dark hole his brothers throwed him into, he could escape the rejection cycle. How? Well, that's easy. He just chose to believe that God loved him, and he kept his faith in God's goodness. Well, Little Joe actually forgave his brothers, and that's how he stayed out of the rejection cycle. In fact, he decided if he ever saw them again, he wouldn't treat them mean like they treated him. No, he'd treat them kind. Now you can see why I like him so much. Well, Little Joe had a bunch of big adventures, and God rode with him like a good partner all the time, and he was very faithful to God, and God was faithful to him too. Well, little things got a little tough back home, and Joe's brothers got caught in a famine. In fact, there was a famine in the whole land. Do you know what a famine is? A famine is when there's no food in the fields, no food in the stores. Well, Joe's brothers went a-looking for food, and they went to Egypt where Joe was, and they didn't know that Joe was there. He didn't know he was alive. In fact, they sure didn't know he was the second man to the king. He was the king's top hand. You see how God blessed him and made him a big man in his time? Well, his brothers was looking for food, and they come to Egypt, and there was Joe, but they didn't recognize him. When they finally knowed who he was, well, they was pretty scared because they thought he was going to tan their hides. Him being a big shot and all, and them being all puny and scared and starving to death. Well, what do you think he done? He said, I'm not mad at you. In fact, bring the whole family over for dinner. Y'all can stay as long as you like. Well, let's see, some years later, they was a-talking, and Joe shared some wisdom with them. I'd like you to listen real close to this. He said something like, "Boys, I've learned that every trail has its share of mud holes and creeks to cross." Well, that's cowboy talk, for hurtful things will happen to you while you're on the trail. And then he said something that's sure good to think on. It's sort of like his cowboy code. He said, as far as I'm concerned, God turned for good what you meant for evil. Now that's good to remember on. You know what else is good to remember on? God can change anything in your life that seems like it's bad, and He can make it for good. How? Well, He's God, that's how. And He can make anything happen. In fact, there's a good verse you ought to remember in Romans. And that Bible verse is, God causes everything to work to good for them that love Him. You remember that, partners. Well, that's pretty much all my time. The sun's starting to go down, so I reckon it's time for me to ride off into the sunset. Why don't all you partners stand up and give the Lord a good hallelujah shout? Well, see you again some other time and ride with your old pal Salt Lick. Adios, amigos.